just a minute. So great. Thank you, Lauren. Oh, so many names coming in. Wonderful to have you all. My friend Sam, I see you. Awesome. I'm seeing so many countries too, which is amazing. All right, I think we'll get started. There are still people coming in for sure, and I think that will happen for the next few minutes. But let's go ahead and get started. So I know you all joined right on time, and we want to get started with you. So welcome to our webinar on the Theory of Change Workbook. As you can see here, we've titled it A Practical Guide for Making Theories of Change Locally Driven and Context Specific. So the reason we did that, we really want to emphasize in this webinar our approach and the process, and really highlighting those two things in particular, locally driven and context specific. And I think you'll see how we've done that as we go through the webinar. I wanted to just say this webinar is tied to Social Impacts, Evidence for Impact webinar series. And the purpose of that webinar series is to really shine a spotlight on examples and innovations in development, and how we can better use evidence to inform our programming decisions and outcomes. And hopefully you'll see that also with this workbook, which starts very much with the first step of a deep understanding of the local context. So when we posted the workbook on USAID Learning Lab, I was informed actually by USAID that it was the most viewed resource on Learning Lab of all time. And so we thought, wow, there's a lot of interest here. It must be filling a bit of a gap that people are having. And so we wanted to have this webinar so we could share more about the resource, make it a little less overwhelming maybe to go into it. But already we've gotten great feedback on it from so many people who have used it. So I hope that you find this useful and you can use it in your work after we get off this webinar. So without further ado, let me just quickly introduce myself and my co-presenters. So I'm Mona Lisa Salib. I'm the Deputy Chief of Party for USAID Learns with Social Impact. At Social Impact, we have a thought leadership working group called LAMP, which stands for Learning, Adaptive Management, and Participation. And of course, what we'll talk about today falls under learning, adaptive management, and participation. And we here I'm in Hanoi, actually, for those who don't realize, it's pretty late here. I'm in Hanoi and I work on the USAID Learns contract, which is the support mechanism to USAID Vietnam. And I just had to say to start off that this workbook and all of the testing of it would not have been possible without the amazing support of USAID Vietnam. So I just want to give them a big shout out for their support and openness and really innovative thinking when it comes to this work. And I want to hand over to my colleagues from the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Jake, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yes. Good afternoon. Good morning. And I'll be Keith and I will be talking about specifically the IUCN experience with this process. Talk to you soon. I should say Jake Brunner. I'm head of the IUCN's Indo-Burma group. So that's the 5 lower Mekong countries based in Hanoi, Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. And Keith is not feeling so well, but Keith, if you want to say hi. Okay, there you are. Great. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'm Keith Symington. I'm a consultant with IUCN based in Vietnam as well. And unfortunately, yesterday I came down, was test positive for COVID. And so feeling a little bit ill, but I think well enough to be on the seminar, but on the webinar. But you know, Jake has heroically offered and agreed to kind of help me out with the presentation as I'm having a bit of time, a difficult time in terms of feeling under the weather and kind of worried I can't complete some thoughts too well right now. Anyway, and really happy to see so many people join us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith. Yes, and thank you to Jake for stepping in quite last minute. we appreciate it for sure. And appreciate you, Keith, trying to be on even though you're not feeling well. Okay, so what we want to do today, I'll show you a little bit the session topic and purpose. We really want to introduce you to the workbook and the main steps in the workbook, and IUCN especially, and I will also be sharing examples of actual use of the workbook. We can't go into too much detail, obviously, in the amount of time we have. You should, from the session today, have an understanding for the overall process. You should get the flow of it, why we do the steps in the way we do. And if you feel that you aren't getting that, please use the Q&A function, or just use it even if you are totally understanding and you just want to explore something else. But please use the Q&A function for your questions. The reason we prefer that to the chat is because you can actually, as a participant, also upvote some questions. So if you see questions also coming in from colleagues on this call, and you are really interested in that question, you can upvote it. So we'll try and use that function as we go. Over 400 people actually registered for this session, and right now we're at about 180 people. So we are in webinar mode on Zoom because it's just a lot of people attending. So for that reason, you'll find that you can't, use your video. But if you have a question, you can raise your hand. You can put it in the Q&A. And if you want to raise your hand, we can take you off mute to actually hear your voice, which I would love to hear other people besides, the three of us. So just wanted to get that out of the way so you know kind of the setup and how to engage. We really want to hear from you. And even if it's not a question, you want to put a comment in the Q&A, that's the best way for us to be able to see it. Okay. So some background. Why did we create this resource? And how did this really come to be? So essentially, as a support contract to USAID Vietnam, we actually started the process because we were helping USAID's implementing partners during startup create their activity mail plans. And what we were seeing was that there were a lot of quite simple theories of change. And for us, the theory of change, and I think for many people on this call, theory of change is really foundational to effective implementation, of course, also to monitoring, evaluating, and learning from our programs. So when we started doing AMAL clinics, what USAID calls activity monitoring, evaluation, and learning plans with implementing partners of USAID during their startup, we just found that those theories of change were quite weak and generic. We saw a lot of simple if-then statements and not really a lot of nuanced understanding of the context, which we assumed was definitely there, not coming out in the theories of change. Also, in general, when we were looking for resources on theories of change, we found a lot of resources valuing logic over context. And it's not that we're saying context should be valued over logic necessarily, but it seemed like logic was being valued at the expense of the local context. And so we really wanted to just make sure that local context considerations were front and center. And you'll see that in the process that we developed. We also found just in general in design processes, there was not really a shared understanding of what a strong theory of change is. There was, there can always be more local engagement from my perspective. So while it was happening, it wasn't maybe as collaborative or as intense as it could be to create theories of change. And in general, we saw that limited connectivity between theories of change and then ultimately our monitoring, evaluation, and learning efforts. So we wanted to tackle all this. And really the workbook came out a little bit by accident. I was responsible for creating the session on theories of change for those activity mail plan clinics, and just realized as I was designing the session that I was essentially making this process and walking people through it. And I had the great pleasure of walking IUCN and other USAID IPs through it and seeing if what we were coming up with could work. Oh, and I wanted to also ask, maybe we can see in the chat, I forgot, what have been some of the challenges that you've seen with TOCs? I'm assuming a lot of people are here because, they're experiencing some challenges. So if there are any that you want to just highlight or maybe different from the ones I've mentioned, I'd love to hear any other ideas. So any challenges that you've experienced with theories of change, What have been your observations? You can put that in the chat. And if anyone wants to come off mute, I'd love to hear a voice. Oh, it's coming so fast. Connecting it with Mel. Design teams approach them after they've designed a program. Oh, that's interesting, right? Because it should inform the design. Scale and boundaries in very complex programs. That's interesting. Too much focus on process or output level results. Actually, that's another thing that I didn't mention. That's a great point, Uchenna. That was a huge issue where we weren't really seeing clear outcomes. And that's something we really wanted to change with this process. Let's see. Teams not understanding why they even need a theory of change. So even just starting from the basics, why do we even need this? This is great. No resources for addressing substantiation gaps. Okay. Outcomes in the TOC that they could not achieve. This was also a big issue for us. I'm not seeing, Daniela, yes. This was also a big issue for us. And again, this is why we start with local context and really hammering home the importance of the local context. Because if we don't start from there, we have to question whether what we're coming up with is achievable and realistic for the context. Okay, these are great thoughts. Thank you all for jumping in with those. Okay, so those were some of our challenges that we were trying to overcome. And so, as I mentioned, I sort of ended up making this a little bit by accident and then realized once we had it and it was working for people that we should, codify it more and put it out there. So that's what we did. And we put it out on USAID Learning Lab. And there's actually a bunch of resources now. There's also theory of change examples, because a big problem also, as I mentioned, was people not really understanding what would we consider a solid theory of change. And so by putting out the examples, one of which came from USAID's Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning, and one of which is actually based on IUCN's ultimate theory of change, we were able to show, this is really what we mean by a solid theory of change. So people knew what they were working towards. And I find that incredibly helpful because once people see it, they're like, oh, okay, I know what you're trying to get us towards. So those samples are really helpful. And Kwabena, if you could put in the chat the resource links. Of course, I don't want you to start opening them now because I want everyone with us, but so you have them for later. Okay. And I see a question here. I'm just going to go ahead and answer that, I think, as we're going. Can one grant have 4 separate TOCs or more? Yeah, this has actually come up for us too. In very complex programs, we just actually had this conversation with a new program called Vietnam Action Against Plastic Pollution. A very complex, very large program, and we suggested to the implementing partner to have multiple kind of nested theories of change, which within a broader theory of change. And the reason we suggested that was that each component was quite unique, and that deep dive would be very helpful in terms of really unpacking how the team thinks change will happen. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about the steps so you see the overview of the process. So here is the visual for the steps. The first step, and we'll go over steps 1 through 3 in more detail in the webinar. The first step is really the understanding of the local context. This is why we titled the webinar Locally Driven and Context Specific, because we really wanted to emphasize that everything starts with a contextual analysis. We were also related to this, trying to avoid that comment I made about logic versus context, and I don't want to make it an either or, but that comment that I was making was because we were seeing that people were having theories of change that you could sort of pick and pluck and put into another context. And that actually, for us, means that the theory of change is not strong enough. It should not be generic. It should be really specific to the context. So that's why we really hammer home step 1 in terms of the contextual analysis. Then from there, with that in mind and with the team sort of having that shared understanding of the contextual analysis, moving into identifying entry points where you identify where really is there momentum for change in the local context. This again heavily emphasizes the local context and what's feasible. And I would say it's one of the things that makes this workbook different than others I've seen, because it so heavily emphasizes starting from the entry points. And this is my personal favorite step, and we'll again get into more detail on that in the webinar. And from there, because we want to start with the local context and really what's feasible, then we do articulate the desired future state, which is focused on outcomes. In other processes that I've seen come out since or came out before, outcomes was actually the starting point. And for us, that didn't make a lot of sense because we wanted to know the outcomes were based on local, what's possible in the local context. I think someone was making that comment in the chat. And so for us, we do entry points first, and then based on that, what's really feasible in the time frame you have, and how can you articulate those outcomes. Step 4 is designing the how. This is where you come up with the interventions. This bridges the gap between the entry points and the outcomes. So how are you going to move from those entry points to actually achieving your outcomes? I will say on the donor side, when we work with USAID on design, we oftentimes mostly skip step 4 because implementing partners will propose possibilities in their proposals. So it's not necessarily necessary on the donor side to outline that specifically, because you want to give that creativity and openness to the partners to propose it based on what they're seeing as possible. And then the last step is really the culmination of all the steps that you've just done. And as you work through the workbook, you'll see how it builds on each other. But essentially, the last step is capturing what you've been talking about in steps 1 to 4, and putting that down in both a visual, which in USAID speak is called a logic model, and in a narrative form, which is usually about a 1 to 3 page narrative, which is able to get at more of the nuance and complexity that the visual cannot. And I do see a question about the slides. Yes, everything will be shared after, so not to worry. Okay, so those are big picture. That's the process. I don't think it's necessarily anything new. I think what's the feedback we've gotten is that what's helpful about it is that it puts this process together in one place. And also, as you'll see, we've borrowed from different frameworks that already exist, for instance, to come up with questions for the contextual analysis. And that also, people have said that's been really helpful, because I'm not looking over here for this framework and this, other things here. It's just all kind of put together in a logical flow. Okay, so I'm going to dive in a bit to step 1. And like I mentioned, we'll dive more into steps 1, 2, and 3. And with step 1, I just want to emphasize, I've said this a bit, but just want to emphasize that what we're trying to do with this is avoid a generalized problem statement. The questions that are asked in step 1 help you really kind of ask yourself the hard questions of what is holding this problem in place in a specific context, and what is enabling progress. So we don't want to just be all negative. There are things that are also always happening in the local context that are, in a positive direction. So what are those things as well? And so what's maybe important or different here is the types of questions asked. As I mentioned, these questions, we honestly didn't come up with most of them. Most of them are borrowed from different frameworks, especially I'll give a shout out to USAID's Applied Political Economy Analysis framework and USAID's 5 R's framework. Both of those frameworks are incredibly helpful in coming up with context questions that really help you ask those bigger picture questions of what's holding this problem in place and what is enabling progress. And I think, again, what's maybe important or slightly different here is that we were also trying to break up or try to stop what can happen, which is the separation of a contextual analysis over here and then TOC much later over here. And so we wanted to really bring these two things together as we move from step 1 into step 2. Okay, so just to give you some flavor, there are many contextual analysis questions in the workbook. These are some of my favorites, and these are the categories that are in the workbook as well. And we'll show you how those, the examples that we have from Vietnam, where we use these questions to really get at what's going on here. And so one that you'll see from political economy analysis is foundational factors. And so those are things like, for instance, in Vietnam, in Hanoi, we have very bad air pollution. One of the foundational factors for that is just the geography of Hanoi. Those are things that you can't change. We can't change, how Hanoi is set up and how, the mountains around us. So that's an example of a foundational factor. Other things you see here, the rules, both the formal and the informal. So these are things you've probably seen and heard of from political economy analysis, but we tried to do it in a way where we weren't, getting, hey, it's political economy analysis. You don't even need to know that. And the workbook just sort of takes you through the process without making it, so obvious. It's just questions that people should really be asking themselves when they're designing programs. So you see some examples there, and there's far more in the workbook. When we do it with teams, people are like, do we have to answer all these questions? No, of course not. I think you have to look and see what's useful to the team. And you also have to think about, well, maybe there's some knowledge that we already have, but maybe we're actually missing this whole area of the relationships, like what are the power dynamics among the actors? We don't really know that, so then we don't know how change can happen if we don't know that. Okay, so I want to hand over to Jake. Jake, if you could talk to us about how IUCN applied this step. Jake, are you there?
Sorry, I am here, and my video is on too. Good. Thank you, Mona Lisa. So I'm going to talk about a USAID funded project called Mekong Delta Coastal Habitat Conservation. It started last year, August 2021. It's a $3 million project over 3 years. And it's got 4 components. I'm going to talk about component 1, which was strengthening protected area management in the West Sea. So the West Sea is not the South China Sea, it's the other part of Vietnam that faces Cambodia and Thailand, basically part of the Gulf of Thailand. And there's a large protected area called Phu Quoc, a very big tourist destination. And it was established, actually it was an MPA, I think, for about 15 years. But in 2010, the Prime Minister issued a decree establishing a network of marine protected areas, I think 10, many of them very small. And in fact, if you look in and you look at the strictly protected area around the MPA, it's absolutely tiny. You could swim around it, no problem, which tells a story. Now, in 2015, IUCN did a management effectiveness evaluation of all 10, and we found out, well, we sort of confirmed what we already knew, or believed we knew, which was that confidence and capacity among protected area staff was extremely low. And that's surprising in many ways, because there's been 20 years or so of consistent international support for training, provision of equipment, capacity building of various kinds. Yet we find that the ability to actually protect these areas is very, very weak. And we through discussions, through our own experience, we quickly understood that the issue was not really a technical gap. It wasn't that people needed more training, more PhDs, more masters, more study tours. or indeed it wasn't a financial gap. It really was a political problem. And that's what I want to talk about next. Next slide. There are basically two problems that we encountered. One is that ever since the decree, the Prime Minister's decree in 2010, essentially MPAs have been managed for tourism. That has overridden all other considerations, including resource protection, the establishment of fish conservation areas, any attempt at fisheries co-management, for example. None of those were attempted, except I think in a few very, very small pilot cases. And the other factor was that there was a chronic unwillingness, deep-seated unwillingness of the MPA, or indeed the province, because these are all, MPAs are all managed under the control of the local province, to enforce the law against illegal fishing. And this actually came to a head a couple of years ago when we were working in Cù Lao Cham, which was Vietnam's arguably its most advanced MPA. We were working with the community to establish a fisheries conservation zone. And after several weeks of negotiation, the community turned around and said, no, we will not participate. We were really surprised and disappointed. But the answer was clear, is why should we change our behavior if at night big trawlers come in and steal our fish? And we found out quickly there was in fact no effective conservation. So although when you go to MPAs, there is a lot of staff, nice headquarters, some smart boats, in many ways it looks very good. The fundamentals in many cases are missing. And this is something that we are focusing on, how to address that. I'll stop there, Mona Lisa. I think it's back to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. I mean, I think, of course, we know that many of you are not familiar with the Vietnam context and this technical area, but what I think we wanted to emphasize here is you can see what the questions that IUCN used, what kinds of things they reveal, and how, I'm sure you can imagine from this, how that might influence what a theory of change looks like for this program that was focused on marine conservation. And so I think without doing this, the fear that we have is that, you don't know if what you're coming up with is realistic. So without thinking this through, another program team could have come in and gone, oh, of course, we got to target, the tourism companies and Phu Quoc, which is, the island here in Vietnam. Well, is that realistic based on what we know about the context? So just wanted to kind of give you a flavor for some of those things that come out of these conversations that really heavily influence how teams end up thinking about what's achievable and what they can do. All right, I'll give you another example. I actually had mentioned this program now that it's been awarded, but we were supporting USAID on the design side of this. And we use the questions from the workbook to understand those big picture questions about what is really holding this problem in place and what is enabling progress. And so you can see some of the, and this was the Vietnam ocean plastics. We did the contextual analysis for USAID, and you'll see we did it also as participatorily as we could manage during COVID times. But we did systems mapping based on the questions that we had in the workbook. So one plug I would say is, even if you don't use the rest of the workbook, step one is really great if you're trying to do an assessment of the problem. And so that's what we did. And so you can see some of the examples, again, using the questions, what really came out. I just highlighted three of the categories in the workbook. But we saw, in terms of relationships, one of the biggest issues in terms of waste management, which includes, of course, plastic waste, is the overlapping nature of state agencies from the local to the national level. And that really affects how waste management is handled. And then we went into the relationships between those entities, who really has power to shake things up and change things. But also, you know, in terms of the question, what is enabling progress? There is this opening with the Law on Environmental Protection of 2020, which kind of creates a foundation potentially for improving the situation. And then also, you know, resources is one of the categories in the contextual analysis. So while there is a national action plan on plastic waste, resources haven't been identified for it. So then what does that really mean? Is that, you know, something that's really going to move forward? So just again, you know, I'm also not obviously plastics expert. Well, maybe it's not obvious, but I'm not a plastics expert. Just to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that come out when you ask these sorts of questions. And in terms of the, you know, we talked about this webinar, we wanted to really focus on context driven and local participation. And so we didn't actually even use the workbook directly with local stakeholders, but we took the concepts from the workbook. So based on the initial analysis that we had done to support USAID, we held a participatory session where we shared some of that learning, but then we also asked, you know, what are we missing? What did we overlook? And so that's where you start to get the input. And we could have even, you know, you could even do this step with everybody in the room. You don't need to have a separate, you know, team doing research. It could be gathering the knowledge of the stakeholders in the room to answer these questions and make sense of it together, assuming you have the right local stakeholders in the room who really know the situation. So really the participatory nature of this is driven by how you manage it. And so I would really highly recommend just using the questions as a basis for, you know, meetings among stakeholders and saying, okay, let's see what knowledge we have in this room and where we might be lacking so that we can go out and get the information that we need to design a really good program. Okay, so I'm going to pause there for questions or comments. I see some questions in the Q&A already. So let's look at these. Yes, as we mentioned, we will share the PowerPoint after, so no worries with that. Let's see, can you talk about how much in advance the MEL team works with officers in technical offices to develop a theory of change? How much in advance before they start doing a concept note, for example, as part of the procurement process? So this sounds, I'm assuming this might be a USAID person. So in our case, I mean, I think that's up to each person and process, right? I mean, you're talking about the MEL and technical offices, and that's a big theme of ours on Learns, is bringing those two capacities together for things exactly like this. So, you know, in our case, we're sort of the MEL support arm, and we help facilitate this process. So I think if, you know, the MEL staff can add value by facilitating the process, by asking those kinds of questions that you see in the workbook and getting technical teams to think, you know, deeply about their programming, I think that can be a great value add and a great collaboration between MEL and technical. So that's definitely something that we promote as much as possible. And you all have a process at Mission requiring technical office. So another question actually related to MEL and technical officers working together. I don't want to just speak for the mission, but based on observation, I would say it's voluntary right now. But again, as much as you can, you know, if you're in a program office, for example, I think a really great value add could be bringing this process to the technical teams. And we've done that with some technical teams at the mission here. Yeah, and I see this comment also from Sabina. Thank you for your comment about, you know, if you're on the implementing partner side and the time for the proposal and design is very short, and it can be really hard to do proper background work ahead of time. So interesting. I mean, I fully agree with that. Usually I think it's about 30 to 60 days maybe for turnaround of a proposal. We actually though, I think a lot of times, I mean, I'll just be frank, proposals are sales documents. And so what we really emphasize too is that once the implementing partner wins, to revisit what's there, because you have several issues. You have the fact that at implementing partners, there's usually a business development team that's completely different, possibly from the actual team that will implement the program. And so when we use this process, it was actually during startup, because it was about, revisiting, really getting into the details. How are we going to make this work? How are we going to, support change happening, and looking at these questions in greater detail. So even if you don't have the time and you're rushing to sort of create that proposal, I really do advocate, as we did with IUCN and others, to revisit that at the startup as a great opportunity for getting the whole team on the same page, and also engaging local stakeholders. Again, it's all about how you do it early on. Okay. Let me just check if there's anything else. Okay, I think we can move on. I do see some other questions, but I want to also make sure we stay on time. And also, if you see questions in there, please feel free, or you see questions in the chat. There's so much knowledge on the call. If you want to go ahead and answer, please go ahead. That would be awesome to have, other people on answering and giving input. I'm sure many of you know much more than I do, so it'd be great to hear from others also. Okay, so with that, we've looked at step one. So if you consider think about yourself in the process, you've essentially now done this contextual analysis in some way, shape, or form. It can be anything from gathering, local stakeholders together and working through some of these questions and really bringing out the knowledge in the room, to even the more rigorous, like contextual analysis, political economy analysis, etc. But you have that information now, and we wanted to bridge the gap between, I have this information now, what do I do with it? And this is really the key of step two. And I think I mentioned it's by far my favorite step. And so we want to share with you how we think about entry points and how we talk about them. And shout out to my colleague, Sean, in our office with us, who, helped bring this thinking into the process. So we give these three metaphors, and we found that they've really helped people. So if you think about local context, where do you see open doors? So where do you see opportunities for change that, you just need to be, a slight catalyst to really get it going? And those are obviously some of your low-hanging fruits, some of your things that you could do relatively easily to make progress on whatever the development challenge is. The next, along the lines of that metaphor, we talk about locked doors. Locked doors are where most of us are probably working. There are opportunities for change, but it really requires a concerted effort. So we tell people, to unlock the door, you need the right key. So that's the series of interventions or strategies that you're coming up with that will unlock that door. And then the last one, which again is also a favorite of mine, is the concept of brick walls. So this is what we would say are not entry points. So these are things, if you think about yourself running into a brick wall, these are things that, there's such entrenched resistance. There's, just a lot of resistance against making progress on that issue. Because of that, it might not be a good use of your time or resources, political capital, et cetera, to shift them. Now, you might play the long game with those things and say, yes, it's a brick wall now, but maybe we could kind of try and knock that down brick by brick, and we'll start now like this. But it's really great to have these intentional conversations and figure out, well, what is an open door versus a locked door versus a brick wall in this context? And oftentimes when we have these conversations with people, they don't all agree. So then it starts opening the conversation of, well, why do you see that as a locked door and I see it as a brick wall? Where are you seeing potential that I'm not seeing? And so those conversations also can be incredibly rich. And you can see here, and actually throughout all the steps, you can really start to hear for listen for assumptions. And this is a big one where assumptions might come out because people might think, oh, that's an open door, but actually for me, that's a locked door. So what assumptions are we making about the situation that make us, that drive us to those different conclusions? So while we don't have a specific step in, and that you saw in the 5-step process on assumptions, in the workbook, we stop for it basically at every step. So I just wanted to also mention that. Okay, so that's how we think about entry points. And the reason, we think this is important is because we really want to help people avoid brick walls. I think a lot of people have been there maybe where they've been working on something for a number of or maybe a year or so, and it's really not going anywhere. Well, was that a brick wall that we could have anticipated if we had done some of this thinking earlier on? The other thing is really the idea of capitalizing on existing momentum. So this is the big purpose of this step, which is figuring out where is there momentum for change within the local context that we can build on. And then in terms of what's important here, this is where really, again, where we make sure we're extremely context specific, and everything in the theory of change flows from this step. So as I mentioned before, if we are clear on the entry points, that can help us be more realistic about what our outcome should be and what we can achieve in the life of the activity or project. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jake to give us, some examples of how this conversation led them to recognize where they had open doors, locked doors, and brick walls. Over to you, Jake.
Thanks, Melissa. Yes, so you'll see the slide summarizes some of the open doors, locked doors, and brick walls. I'm not going to go through every point, but perhaps just to pick up on some of the most important ones. Without doubt, the most important open door or momentum opportunity was the issue of the yellow card by the EU. It's actually in 2017, October 2017, so 5 years ago, almost exactly. The EU had been grumbling for quite a long time about Vietnamese fishers fishing illegally in extraterritorial, sort of basic outside of their, in other countries' territorial waters. This concern was never seriously addressed. And then 5 years ago, the sort of EU ran out of patience and rather abruptly issued a yellow card. This was quite a shock to the system. I think they thought they could fob the EU off for another few years. But this has had a dramatic impact. So in 2017, total seafood exports about 1.5 billion. That declined in 2019 down to 1.3. And if, as could well happen, the yellow card turns into a red card, that would represent a loss of about $500 million a year, equivalent to about a third of all, by value, of all of Vietnam's seafood exports. So a huge loss. And it could even be more than that, because if you're barred from exporting to the EU, that's kind of like the gold standard. So other countries, other major importers of seafood, Vietnamese seafood, then start to question imports from Vietnam and look for other lower risk sources. So this has triggered substantial change, particularly legally. Fisheries law was updated, penalties were increased, a huge program of installing proper port monitoring infrastructure, VMSs, vessel monitoring systems, were installed. And this would come out, there was a while where every once a week, the Prime Minister would be standing up saying, telling the provinces to get their act together. And every 6 months, the EU visits. And this scrutiny, if you like, has really changed the atmosphere in which we work. So the government is now serious about getting the yellow card lifted because of the huge economic risk. and it is forcing the provinces, which have a high degree of independence in Vietnam, very high degree of independence, to, for example, get all the boats, big boats registered and the VMS installed and actually turned on throughout the voyage. It's reading between the lines, the EU is not yet satisfied. So that pressure will probably continue. And this has created space, for example, for us to work more effectively with local fishing communities to start to plan fish conservation areas, knowing there's a much higher degree that these areas will be respected, particularly by the inshore fishermen. Now, another point I want to mention here is this transition to mariculture, increased investment in private sector mariculture. Vietnam has a long, somewhat controversial history for aquaculture, particularly bassa and shrimp. It's been associated with significant environmental damage. And there are risks with mariculture, but it's important to bear in mind that Vietnam, the bottom line is we got 1 million too many fishermen. And there is no easy solution. There is no exit strategy for so many fishermen. So looking for new opportunities for employment in mariculture in particular, high quality, often foreign managed, foreign owned mariculture, I think is an extremely important opportunity. The locked doors, again, I think the traditional focus simply on more capacity building, more training is doomed to failure. That's been well documented, and a focus strictly on enforcement. Likewise, now that with the increased pressure, if you like, scrutiny provided by the yellow card, there's much more transparency about where fishing practices are happening, and there's an opportunity to support co-management, fisheries co-management, which the law now allows. So these are some of the entry points that we're pursuing. I think over to you, Mona Lisa.
Great, thanks, Jake. I just wanted to highlight, one thing I like about the slide and why we wanted to show it is that, somebody could come into a context and think it makes perfectly logical, technical sense to do capacity building or to try a payment for environmental services scheme or to focus on enforcement. I mean, these are technical solutions to a technical problem. What we're trying to do with this step and kind of the big picture from what Jake was talking about is not only think about what makes logical technical sense, but what makes actual sense within the context. So IUCN, having a long history in Vietnam, asking these questions, was able to figure out actually, like, we could do a little bit of that, but that's not really going to solve the issue. So really kind of thinking deeply about not just what is a rational, technical, logical solution, but what is a solution that could actually work in this specific context. So just wanted to show you also the example, and somebody had asked me asked us in a Q&A, do you work on the before award side or after? And we do both. So Jake's example and IUCN's example is support post-award during startup, as I was mentioning, as they're working on their activity, monitoring, evaluation, learning plan. We always start that process from the theory of change. We also, though, this example is from pre-award during the design phase, in this case with USAID. And so what we did, again, I facilitated this session. Again, this was COVID times. I guess we're still in COVID times, but heavy COVID times. And so we facilitated the session online with local stakeholders, especially environmental organizations, and didn't use the workbook. I just want to emphasize, it's about taking the concepts. You don't have to literally use the workbook, but people do that and that also works, but just taking it into your facilitation plan and having it be the basis for the conversations that you have with people. So in this case, you can see the Post-it notes from that session in terms of, what are the entry points in terms of single-use plastic? What's your what are your thoughts on what's an open door, a locked door, or a brick wall? And people immediately get this concept, I have to say. I mean, it takes 1 second to explain, and people are like, oh, it's this and this and this. And then you start to see, you know, where there's agreement or disagreement. And again, it's a very useful and fruitful conversation. So I think that does it for my personal favorite step. But of course, all the steps are important. I just really like that one myself. And so let's look now at step 3. So step 1, you've thought very critically about the local context. You've answered some big questions that will affect what your design ultimately should look like. You've really uncovered some key things, you know, who are the key actors, what are the relationships, who has power, who's a champion, who's not, all these kinds of questions that are about the local context and whether a technical solution would even work. And then you've used that information that you've gathered to figure out where are the entry points. So you've got your understanding, shared understanding of the open doors, of the locked doors, and the brick walls that you're likely to try and avoid and not hopefully waste too much time on. So now you come to step 3, where building on all of that, you can think about what is our North Star here? What are we trying to achieve? And why we do this again after the entry points is because we're trying to make sure that the outcomes are realistic based on what's possible in the local context. Because again, I think people could come in with logic and go, oh, you know, in 5 years, let's do this. But is that really feasible based on the local context? So we want to make sure it comes out of the contextual analysis and understanding of the entry points. So I think I've also already covered, the ensuring realism, that you really just, that's kind of hammering home that point. And we do have people like we did with IUCN where, you know, they might have, especially maybe some of the, like IUCN is a good example, actually, an organization that has a long history in a country and will likely continue to have a long history, even without USAID funding necessarily, where you, and this is also the case, actually, I would say with local NGOs who have that long-term thinking because they're local and they want to, you know, see an issue like disabilities or environmental pollution for the long term. So when you have conversations with local organizations or other organizations that are more long term in their thinking, you can sort of chunk it out and you can say, okay, I know your agreement or your contract is only 3 years or 5 years, but if they have that long term vision, let them bring that into the conversation. It can be really powerful. The other thing that's different here is we use something called types of impact as a framework. And I think this is really an interesting approach. And I've used it in a lot of strategic planning with USAID. And I'll show it to you now. This comes from a colleague, Liz Ruetti, and it's also on Learning Lab. And maybe Kwabena, you can put the link actually in the chat from the previous slide. But what this does is it forces people to think about what kind of impact can we really realistically have with this program. And I think, you know, what you'll see in the resources, she's saying, we tend to think we'll always have transformative impact. We sort of go into development programs going, it's going to be transformational. But actually, there's all these other kinds of impact that we need to consider. And maybe that's actually what we're trying to do. So to give you an example, you can kind of see the thing to look at here is the status quo. So meaning without any, you know, intervention from outside donor forces, what would the situation be like moving forward into the future? You can see the x-axis is time. So in the case of transformative impact, you see that the status quo stays the same over time, and the program is coming in and trying to, you know, increase or improve outcomes pretty dramatically, pretty quickly. If you look at palliative impact, it's quite the opposite. The status quo is going to go downhill no matter what anybody does. And we might, I mean, you could think about the COVID outbreak all over the world like this. No matter what anybody did, there were still going to be tons of people who unfortunately died from COVID. But can we do anything to stop the bleeding in a way, to make it less bad than it would have otherwise been? And then you can, there's many, there's, I think, 6 types of impact that she lists. And when we do this with teams, it also really gets them thinking about what is possible in this situation. And it starts again to reveal assumptions. So people, that a team would be sitting, or even, whoever you do this with, people would think, oh, I think it's opportunistic. Well, why do you think that? What is making you think that? Have that conversation. People see it differently, and you start to uncover their assumptions. And also, every time I've done this, literally every time, people come up with their own like combo. And so it lets people be creative and really think deeply about the current situation, and what is their program can do. So I really like this tool and resource, and Kwabena put it in the chat for you, but it's also linked, of course, in the workbook. So we start here with the outcomes because we want people to be thinking, how are we even big picture thinking about our outcomes? That affects how you articulate the outcomes at the end. So I'll show you. I'll turn over to Jake, actually. He'll talk a little bit about how IUCN was thinking about their outcomes using this. Over to you, Jake.
Thank you, Mona Lisa. If I recall, we had this was not straightforward. Each of those models, if you like, had merit. One could map what we do, what we hope to achieve against them. But realistically, I think this is where we ended up in terms of the proactive impact. Bearing in mind that this is only a 3-year project, it's ambitious, but it's not delusional. And we expect to, we expect to demonstrably, measurably reduce the rate of degradation, measured in terms, for example, of mangrove loss, of coral reef damage, levels of illegal fishing. That's realistic within 3 years, but primarily through changing mindsets. And I think this is true generally in Vietnam. Vietnam is now a middle-income country. It's largely self-sufficient financially. You can't buy success. You have to come in with good data, good arguments. And we spend a lot of time searching for, and hopefully finding champions in government. People, if you like, who think like us. And sometimes we sort of get very frustrated and we say, oh my God, the government it's the brick wall. We're making no progress. But actually what you find is even within a provincial department, you've got people, you've got the dinosaurs, and then you've got the progressive thinkers. And our job is to identify the progressive thinkers, nurture them, and work with them. I should also point out that everything IUCN has achieved in terms of significant policy impact, absolutely not done by ourselves. It's always been done in partnership. And in this case, Wildlife Fund is a partner on this project, and they bring in complementary skills and experience. We're delighted that we wouldn't be able to achieve this without their support. We also work very closely, particularly with the World Bank, which is starting a big new fisheries management project. I think that's all I can say at this point on this slide, Mona Lisa. I know I got one more to go, but over to you for now.
Yeah, no, sounds good. Thanks, Jake. Yeah, you can see there, just I think when we, did this process together, sort of just help focus on what was achievable. So this, like you see here, can we focus actually on laying the groundwork with these mindset shifts, then that enables us for longer term impact after. And IUCN, as I mentioned, was in a unique position to really be thinking long term beyond the 3-year USAID award. Okay, so you see the steps here again. We've gone into detail on steps 1, 2, and 3. And as I mentioned, step 4, design the how, is bridging the gap between how do I go from entry points to outcomes. So it gets at more detailed intervention levels. And this, as I mentioned, is a step that often we mostly skip on the donor side with USAID. And USAID will often provide, illustrative ideas or activities, interventions under the activity. But with implementing partners, obviously, who are in startup, this is sort of the meat that turns into their work plan. So, you know, they've done all this kind of big picture thinking, revisited that, and then this step helps them. Okay, so what should we do this year to move towards that? Then step 5, as I mentioned, is really just the synthesis of all that thinking. You know, and usually here, Keith actually was the one from IUCN who sort of, you know, everyone was in these sessions together. But then Keith, you know, took all that amazing thinking that the team had done and put it together in the narrative format and maybe the visual. I don't actually know who did the visual. But just to say that this part of the process might be the point where you stop, you know, writing. You don't want to write by committee necessarily. You might assign somebody on the team, you know, and that could be the mill person. I mean, it could be whoever on the team makes sense, but let's take this, synthesize it, make it clear, make it, you know, as useful as possible so that we keep using the theory of change throughout implementation. Or if you have also, you know, a visually talented person, and here you can start with the visual or the writing. I tend to go with writing first. Other people are visual first. So whatever works for the group. So this is a lot of text, but I think maybe I can just ask Jake to not go into the details of, you know, what's here, but really how you came to the actor-based visual and way of thinking about the TOC, because I think that's really interesting for people. In our resources, you'll see actor-based TOCs as an example. And just over to you, Jake, to explain that a little bit more.
So I think this actor-based theory of change really emerges from this, what we reckon was our proactive impact model, which was we can have measurable impact, but it's going to be modest, it's going to be limited within 3 years. I mean, most of the big policy reforms that we've been involved in Vietnam, you know, take 7 years, you know. Things move slowly in Vietnam. Our particular flavor of communism, if you like, power is very broadly diffused. We don't, very different in that sense from China. It's diffused sort of horizontally and vertically. And under those conditions, it's not as if you can go and, you know, target an individual and, you know, through a stroke of the pen, solve your problems. You know, that's not going to have any impact on you know, protected area management, MPA management effectiveness, for example. So our approach was twofold: working through government and really emphasizing and strengthening the role of the Phu Quoc Management Board to serve as a convener, bringing multiple stakeholders together to recognize that there are problems in common, particularly illegal trawling, loss of seagrass beds, reefs, solid waste, marine plastics. These are recognized problems that everyone has an interest in solving. It requires different actors to come together. This is the sort of thing IUCN does a lot of, this kind of multi-stakeholder facilitation. And then specifically on business, which are big investors and big actors on the island, is working with them to sort of clarify key points to share with government. Although businesses are very important actors, big employers, huge part of the economy, they don't actually have straightforward dialogue relationships with the provincial government. And that's a real problem, because many of the problems, such as putting in, you know, for example, electrification, electric vehicles. This, you know, Phu Quoc is an island. You can't drive there. There's no bridge. A fantastic opportunity for electric vehicles, but that's something then that has to be negotiated and implemented by government. So this sort of helping to bridge the government and the business sector, I think, is essential to having any real impact. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jake. And I know Keith wanted to just add a comment on using the actor-based theory of change.
Yeah, thanks. As Jake mentioned, there was I think, a fair bit of discussion about what approach to use. But once we arrived at that, it was pretty clear that because we're looking at changing mindsets primarily, an actor-based model just seemed to fit that approach so much better. But we also chose it because, well, for one thing, ICN has and the partners, WWF, have a high level of confidence in terms of understanding who the actors are. So I think if anybody is working in areas where they really do understand who the actors are, and how current circumstances influence their behavior, etc., then that really is something to maybe take a look at. And also, when we were doing this, Mona Lisa, remember all the we were looking at this AMEL, document that was to come afterwards, and we're just realizing, we're tracking change so much that we thought it'd be easier to track change and monitor that change, that behavior change is actually happening if we took this approach. It's just visually, but also just in terms of the theory of change itself, we could track that a lot better, I thought, by using an actor-based model. It's kind of support qualitative monitoring.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Keith, for adding that. And it's actually aligns with what I was saying in the chat as well about how it makes it easier to monitor later during implementation. Great. Okay, so just as a quick recap, maybe I'll go back one. So we've taken you through overall the steps. We've taken you in more detail on step 1, step 2, and step 3. And so now I just want to turn to Q&A and see what questions still remain for you. We had some come in through the Q&A function, so we'll start there. But if there are others, please start typing or raise your hand and we can have you come off mute. Okay, so let's see what's in here. I did see one that was actually a good segue to what we were just talking about. Can you talk about how this process sets you up to revisit the TOC during implementation? This is a fantastic question from an anonymous attendee. Yes, so in the workbook at each step, mostly steps 2 and 3, we heavily emphasize and have kind of call outs for how this will connect to your monitoring, evaluation, and learning later. The main call outs, or the main ways I think about it, are in terms of monitoring changes to the entry points. So as you're implementing, the context could change. So are the things that you thought were open doors, did they suddenly change? And if so, what are the implications of that? So you can revisit what you considered your entry points, and maybe something in the context changes that suddenly makes a brick wall not such a brick wall. And so this is where paying attention to your context, and then seeing, has anything changed in the context that might make us think differently about what we thought were the open doors or the locked doors or the brick walls. I think that's really important and connected to your MEL. Obviously, with the outcomes, the step 3, very connected to MEL, because once you've articulated that, that's something that you need to track during the life of the activity or the project. And this is where also partly why this came to be, and somebody said it earlier, is that I think teams have a really hard problem thinking in terms of outcomes and not just kind of tracking the outputs. So that's something we heavily emphasize in the workbook and in the trainings we do with implementing partners. And so those are kind of the two, and those are the two things I would emphasize. But in the workbook, you'll see more detail, and there's a sort of call out like connection to MEL during implementation. Okay, so let's see what's next, and let's see what gets, actually, if there's upvotes. Okay, can you share more about the facilitation approach and logistics? How did you identify who to include? What did the agenda look like? Okay, great questions. In our team, we did actually a training of trainers of how to facilitate this process. That is not necessarily publicly available right now, but I think if you had a facilitation background, you could sort of go through the workbook and easily kind of adopt it into your facilitation plan. In terms of our experience, as I mentioned before, when we do it on the USAID side, it can look very different with each team. We had one team who literally was going back and forth with the actual work with the ministry, like back and forth, and you know, kind of doing it online, and of course talking about it, but it was literally they were filling it out together and, you know, getting input from the ministry as they were going. We've done it, as you saw, where I didn't even use the, you know, the workbook per se, but I took concepts from the workbook and included that into my facilitation plan with local stakeholders. So I think it has to be based on your context. It has to be based on how much time you have. As much as possible, why we called this locally driven is your decisions about who to include will obviously dictate how locally driven and how much local ownership there is over the theory of change. In terms of agenda, in the case of IUCN, we went through this in 2 half-day online sessions. And so that's possible. We did it with a intact team who had a lot of knowledge about the existing context, about the local context. And so that made that possible. But again, if you're in the stage where you're just like, you need to maybe start with the contextual analysis. So it just depends on what your situation is. I can't say there's one solid, you know, facilitation plan. But take the parts of it and make it work for your situation, I would say. Let's see, a question from Shelley. Hi, Shelley. Have you observed contractual or agreement revisions needed based on learning from TOC implementation? If so, what are the challenges, opportunities in making those revisions for IPs and USAID? So in our case, no, we haven't, no IP has needed to make any contractual or agreement revisions. We actually co-facilitated, Shannon is on the call, with PPL, a theory of change training for USAID, where we also had OAA kind of give their take on whether, if there were changes to the theory of change, whether that would require contractual or agreement changes. In our context, and I think I would kind of emphasize making sure the agreements or contracts are flexible to begin with. What we see generally is that USAID is going to be likely unwilling to change your ultimate outcomes. But within that framework, there's flexibility, at least in the awards that we have here. So I think you'd have to kind of back up a few steps and go, how can we make the agreements or the contracts more flexible? But I think ultimately the thing that would never change, or that would require a massive effort if it was ever going to be modified, are the, you know, the outcomes USAID laid out in the solicitation should stay the outcomes, but within that, what can you change in order to reach those outcomes either more efficiently or more effectively? If anybody from USAID actually wants to take that question, that would be great as well, but that's been our experience. Let's see, what other questions? So there's a question here about IPs have 90 days from the contract award to submit the email, thus don't have sufficient time to make a proper contextual analysis and develop a proper TOC. Do you have any practical recommendations to address this gap, please? This is a great question. I'd love to hear actually from others on the call if you want to write in the chat or you want to come off mute. In our experience, I mean, one thing that could help to make this go faster, I actually think, is more local collaboration. So again, if you sort of bring the right actors into the room, could you work through this process together, including the contextual analysis? Because oftentimes we're thinking we got to do all this rigorous research, but maybe actually the best thing to do is bring the right people into the room and have them talk about the situation in greater depth using some of these questions, and then move through the process of TOC development. I'm trying to think also, maybe IUCN, you could comment on that. You know, you had the same restrictions, you know, that I think it was 90 days. That's kind of standard. Did you feel that was kind of too much to overcome, or how did you feel about that?
Keith, do you want to have a stab?
Well, sorry, Monali. So what was I'm just trying to bring up the question because I was on the regular chat as well.
Oh, no worries. It's, did you feel like you couldn't turn around the activity mail plan in time? Were you too crunched for time? Did you feel, this question is basically, is there really even enough time to be doing all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I thought there was enough time. If we hadn't have gone through that really excellent process we did with you and the team, it might have been a different story, to be honest. Because I found it, I think we all found it very, very useful and quite straightforward. And having everything recorded, I was able to go back and check on things and going through the email. So yeah, in this case, I thought it was enough time.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Keith. There's a couple more questions I see, and please, if others want to raise their hand, I'd love to hear voices. We can take you off mute. I see a question from another, or maybe the same anonymous attendee. How often do you update the theory of change afterwards? And does that require mods to the award? So again, in our case, when we had that engagement from the Office of Acquisition and Assistance in Vietnam, they seemed to think that mostly it would not require modification if there were changes. But I think again, below changing the outcomes, right? Like you can sort of change how you're trying to get there, but you can't ultimately change the outcome that USAID had put forward. But again, if somebody from USAID is on, especially an OA person, it'd be great to hear your voice. And then how often do you update the TOC afterward? We're actually right now working on another tool to do theory of change reviews. So this is something that we're hoping to put out this year. Our general advice to implementing partners is to review it annually. And USAID Vietnam often puts a required pause and reflect in their awards. And so right before work planning, everyone in Vietnam, also USAID, everyone pretty much on the same timeline. So all work plans from all implementing partners are due at the same time. And so a lot of those awards have required pause and reflects that should happen before work planning. So our advice is reflect on the theory of change at that annual pause and reflect, use it to inform, next year's work plan. Question from Catherine. This is more a logistics question, but I'm curious what your and others go-to software are for creating these visuals that are user participation friendly. That is a great question that I don't have a fantastic answer to. If anyone has an idea, please put it in the chat. I think what we see is mostly people are kind of using, PowerPoint. We on our team use something called Visme, V-I-S-M-E, where we create a lot of our visuals. It's super easy to use. It's helped make me a novice graphic designer, so you might want to try that one. If anyone else has ideas, please put it in the chat for Catherine. Question, do you find that USAID technical officers typically engage with local stakeholders when developing a TOC or no? And do they have any background in TOC development from general COR, AOR training or no? To be honest, I'm not familiar enough with the COR, AOR training. Again, if somebody from USAID wants to jump in. I got somebody, Lisa, I think are you from USAID? Did I see that correctly? Can we unmute Lisa, maybe? Lisa, I believe you are unmuted. But we can't hear you. Okay, we might be having some sound issues with Lisa. Holler, if you can come back on. I hear sound.
Hello, sorry, this is Nicholas. I don't know if you're asking for.
I was asking for Lisa, but if you want to say something, please go ahead.
No, I just made a comment. So there's many theories of change. They may not be spoken or written down rather. There's the core theory of change that drives the activity. But for example, we had and I work with USAID Uganda. There's a theory of change that if we provide a particular intervention that prevents violence against children in schools, so that's SRGBV is school-related gender-based violence. If we do this activity, then we will have children will come to school, they will stay in school, and they will perform better. And the research, which was rigorous as an experimental design, quasi-experimental, and it showed that in fact that was not the case. The control school had there was no difference between the control and treatment. In fact, the control did better in some cases. So in that situation, you would have to change your theory of change for that a sort of a sub TOC. And then as far as the 90 days for the AML, as long as it's considered a organic or rather living document, I don't, and I'm a little new to USAID, not familiar with all of the requirements, but it's tied to the work planning and quarterly reporting. So I think that's a reason for the 90 days, but something quick and dirty with the understanding that it's going to be adapted along the way. The only thing that would trigger a modification is if there's if an activity is eliminated or something tangible like that. But if it's about the methodology or the approach, that shouldn't be a problem. And then the last comment I had in the initial comment was about a gentleman named John Hoven who did some work with adaptive theories of change a while back. I'll share the resource. He was never able to quite articulate it very well. I think the work you're doing probably does a better job, but it might give confidence to your own design to review it. So I'll share that around with the group, and happy to answer any questions with my limited knowledge of USAID, which is still a mystery after a few years over.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, are you able to talk now? Okay, I think she's still having technical difficulties. To go back to the question though, which now I think I've misplaced. In terms of USC technical officers and yes, we see that. We're seeing it more and more as well, at least in the Vietnam mission. And I think having a support contract like ours that can help with the facilitation of that is really helpful to missions. I know that some missions don't always have the support contract involved in design. Our support contract is, and I think it's been incredibly useful to just have that facilitation resource, be able to do things like this and facilitate those conversations with local stakeholders. It makes it a lot easier on USAID to be able to engage when they have that support. Okay. So I want to move on actually. We haven't gotten to all the questions, but we do need to start closing. So we finish at 10 a.m. Thank you all so much for your questions and your participation. So we'll see if we can figure out a way to answer some questions maybe after and share that out with the materials. But for now, we'll move into the closing. So in terms of the resources and where you can find them, Kwabene from Social Impact had put them in the chat. Maybe you can just drop those in again, Kwabene. Of course, everything's linked in the slide deck, which we will share out. Right now, of course, because we made this in Vietnam, the materials are available in English and Vietnamese. We also just recently created a workbook in slide format, as we were thinking for people who wanted to maybe facilitate online or in person, to be able to use it more in slide format, which might be just easier for people. So when you get the slides, that will be linked. Right now it's just linked to our Google Drive. It will eventually be on USAID Learning Lab with the other resources. I wanted to just make a quick plug for, if after this you use the workbook or you use parts of it, we'd love to hear any feedback. So far, we've gotten really positive feedback on it, but if something, wasn't working, every once in a while we'll make updates to it. So if there's any feedback, we'd love to hear it. My email is there. You can reach out to me on that. The other thing is, people will write me and say, hey, do you have it in Spanish? Hey, do you have it in French? Right now, we only have it in English and Vietnamese. If, you find yourself, hey, I need to translate it for, I'm working in French, or I'm working in Spanish, or I'm working in Arabic. Please let us know if you translate it, because then we will put it up and share it. It will get shared more widely, and happy to give, whoever does that credit. We're especially interested in Spanish, French, and Arabic. Okay. And then I want to just make a plug for our Evidence for Impact webinar series. So we've already done a few past webinars. So when you get the links, you'll also see, or get the slides, sorry, you'll see the links to those. We did a great one on using evidence to shine a light on countering trafficking in persons, developmental evaluation, social impact as a leader in developmental evaluation. We also did a really interesting series on collaborating, learning, and adapting in organization development and the overlaps there. And so if you're interested in those topics, I encourage you to check the other links. And Kwabena, I think, can also just put those directly in the chat now for you, so you don't have to wait for the slides. I want to make a plug for a webinar that me and a colleague, Jess Ziegler, are leading next month here in Vietnam. We created this collaborating, learning, and adapting maturity tool for implementing partners. We'll also be joined by our colleague from USAID's Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning, Lauren Hinthorn, and 2 implementing partners from Vietnam who have used the new tool, WinRock and FHI 360. So space will be limited for that one because it'll be more interactive than this one. This was more of a traditional webinar. So if you are interested, I encourage you to sign up as quickly as you can. And you're actually all the first people to see the registration link. So you get first dibs on that. Okay, and a big thank you for all of you participating and asking great questions. It's been really great sharing this resource with you, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thank you so much. Have a good night or good afternoon or good morning. All right, see you all.
Thank you, Mona Lisa. Bye. Thank you for your facilitation.
Thank you, Keith and Jake. Thank you so much. All right.
Very welcome.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey, Mona Lisa.
Yes.
Hi, it's Nicholas. How are you?
Good. How are you? I think we're
Good.
trying to. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to know where to put to send any attachments that I mentioned. Since folks
you can use my email, and actually for anyone still on, so my email is here. If you could take a quick note of it, msalib@socialimpact.com. For those who are still on, I did forget one thing, which is that in Vietnam, we are currently looking for a deputy chief of party and monitoring director. So if you're interested in doing work like this and joining our team, please check it out, and other positions with social impact on the website. Okay. Bye, everyone. All right, let's close it.
Bye. Thanks again. Great event.
Thank you.